So what about conclusions? So knowing how to conclude an essay can be a challenge, especially for beginning college writers that really are used to one style of conclusion. A lot of times they're told to summarize a paper and not add anything new. But oftentimes this can lead to boring and flat conclusions with really no substance. On the contrary, college instructors really want a strong conclusion, and the conclusion is the perfect place to take the discussion actually one step further. Since the conclusion is the last thing the reader will see and remember, it should be strong and powerful. So the following are some strategies for writing strong and thought-provoking conclusions. So conclusions, basically the framework of a conclusion, consists of three different things. You first restate or repackage the thesis statement. Second, you answer the so what. And third, you relate your conclusion back to the opening hook. So let's break these down. The first thing is you restate or repackage the thesis statement. Now, no teacher wants to see the same word for word thesis statement from the introduction, just cut and pasted and dropped into the conclusion. That is boring. And really, your reader doesn't want that either. We ask you as instructors to repackage and restate your thesis. Now, oftentimes students are like, why? Why do I need to do this? It's impractical. It would just be easier to cut and paste. Well, sure, it would be easier to cut and paste, but that's not really what happens in the real world. In the real world, you are surrounded by repackaging and restating of thesis statements all the time. For example, take a look at the Starbucks logo. From 1971 to 2011 and beyond, the Starbucks logo has actually been repackaged and restated numerous times. But like a thesis statement, at its core, it's basically the same thing. It's still selling the same product, and this logo is essentially saying the same thing. Even 40 years later, that restatement and that repackaging has kept a consistency, and that's what a good thesis does. And it isn't just with Starbucks. The cool kids are doing it too at Apple. So in 1976, if you'll look closely, there is an apple in there. It's kind of shining in the tree, and it has Apple Computer Company. But 2007 and beyond, completely different logo. But at its core, no pun intended since it is an apple after all, it is the same. They've just kind of repackaged themselves. And it's not just with technology or with drinks, it's also with fast food. So what's this a picture of? This is the original Wendy. You know, the girl that the fast food franchise is named after. Maybe you're not familiar with her looking like that. Maybe this is what you're more used to. This has been around for decades. So they took the original Wendy and they repackaged her, made her a cartoon. And today, well, they've repackaged her again. They've made her contemporary, made her somebody that is more relatable to the audience. But just like a thesis statement, they've restated and they've repackaged. So what would this look like in writing? Well, that's a good question. An introductory thesis, remember in college we always want you to make an argument. Maybe it would look like something like this. Although many people question the validity of underwater welding as a viable career, they haven't looked closely enough. This dangerous job greatly impacts Americans' everyday lives and should be taken more seriously. So there's an argument here. This is not a statement of the sky is blue because of X, Y, and Z. This isn't a high school thesis statement. This is an argumentative thesis statement. This is more academic. So if I were repackaging it for my conclusion, maybe it would look something like this. Since underwater welding is misunderstood and maligned as a career, the effects such perceptions have on all U.S. citizens need to be more closely analyzed. So at the core, it's basically arguing the same thing. Maybe the conclusion, at least in this instance, this thesis is a little bit shorter, but still I'm arguing as a writer the same things. Plus, I'm reminding the reader of what my original argument was. So the first step is to restate and repackage your thesis statement. The second step is to answer the so what. Now, I'll be honest, this is not the easiest part of a conclusion, and oftentimes this is what trips students up the most, is answering the so what. Why? Well, because requires a different mindset. It requires oftentimes students to look at their paper and their topic in a new light. So you've written a paper. So what? Why should your reader care about this paper? They spent 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes reading this paper. So what? Well, I try and counsel students to kind of think about it, the so what, as a gift with purchase. You're basically telling your reader and you're providing them, thank you so much for reading my paper, and as my gift to you, here's what I'm going to tell you that you can do with it in the best possible way. You're going to give them some of your insight, some of your wisdom, and you're going to say, sure, this is kind of a very focused idea, but here's how else you can use it. And that's what that gift with purchase is. So maybe this analogy isn't working for you. So consider it as a moral. What's the moral of your paper? We're all pretty much familiar with the tortoise and the hare. But what was the moral of that story? Slow and steady wins the race. It's a long, involved, very descriptive story, but at its core, at its moral, there was something that we as readers could take away. So what's the moral of your paper? What's the takeaway for your paper? How does this relate to a bigger picture? Maybe you need to take a step back and see how this argument or what you're doing in this argument can apply to something else. Why is it significant? Why should we care about this argument? And how does this topic or what you have done in this paper, how can those moves be applied elsewhere? So we'll go back to this idea of the underwater welding. So this is the thesis statement that was repackaged for the conclusion. Since underwater welding is misunderstood and maligned as a career, the effects such perceptions have on all U.S. citizens needs to be more closely analyzed. Well, so what? I mean, presumably I'm not really affected by underwater welding. Most people haven't even heard of it. So why should we care about this? Well, there's a few different ways you can kind of answer the so what. People deserve to feel proud of the job they have and not be ashamed. Okay, so for this example, I've used underwater welding, but what about people that work at McDonald's? If you ask them where they work, and especially if they're over the age of 30 and they're working at McDonald's, they're kind of ashamed of where they work, and they don't want to say it. Why? Because that job isn't looked on kindly in, society and culture. If you talk to some people, sometimes they're like, well, I'm just a teacher or I'm just a nurse. There's no just about a job. And people shouldn't feel that way. So maybe that's the big so what from this paper. Underwater welding is kind of misunderstood and people are like, oh, that's a fake job. If that's the case, and if underwater welders feel that way, then if somebody asks them what they do, they're probably just going to be like, I'm a welder, but they won't mention that it's underwater because maybe they're ashamed or they don't want all the questions. And plus, because if we get to know what an underwater welder does, we have a greater understanding. And if we're able to understand that job a little bit better, we're less likely to criticize and have a greater appreciation of all jobs. And it's amazing the breadth and the depth of the different kinds of jobs that are available in the world. And thirdly, maybe we don't even want to look at the underwater welding or the job at all. Maybe we just want to look at the steps and the close analysis that occurs in this paper. Because close analysis is important. Maybe it's not going to apply to a job, but we should really critically think about houses we buy, cars we buy, major decisions that we make in our life, moving someplace or things like that, who we're going to marry. And honestly, in order to make informed decisions and come across as educated, we need to have these close analysis skills. And of course, there's hundreds of thousands of other ways that you can go in the so what. Ultimately, it's going to be up to you as a writer to figure out what that moral is, that gift with purchase, the so what. Lastly, relate your conclusion, the last lines of your conclusion, back to the first lines of your paper related to the opening hook. So if I'm talking about underwater welding, maybe this is my opening hook. Imagine crystal clear waters, tropical fish swimming by you, and the feeling of weightlessness while scuba diving. Sound like a holiday? Well, if you're an underwater welder, that's just another day at the office. So not your typical series of questions or shocking statistic or a quote from somebody else. It's actually engaging. It takes the reader out of their world and into your paper. So how would this relating back to the opening hooks look like in your conclusion? Well, maybe the last lines of my paper would sound like this. So with a greater understanding, maybe an underwater welder's job won't be seen as another day at the office, but will be appreciated for the dangerous and difficult job it actually is. So I took that phrase, another day at the office, and I used that in my closing lines. I could have taken the idea of water and used that. I just decided to do another day at the office. And what happens when you use your closing lines to relate to your opening hook is you kind of complete the circle in your paper. It creates a sense of closure for your reader. How many times have you read a paper or even watched a movie and been like, that was it? Isn't there more? There should be more. It doesn't feel like this is done. If you relate your closing lines to your opening hook, you create the cyclical thing, and you what is often called bookend your paper. You have one bookend that keeps your books on the shelf, keeps your ideas in your paper, and that's the opening hook, and then you have the other bookend that closes your paper, keeps the other books on the other side from falling off the shelf, and you create this secure, cohesive paper. And that's really what this relating to the opening hook does. So, you first restate or repackage your thesis, you answer the so what, and then you relate it back to the opening hook. Now, if you look closely at this order of the conclusion, it's actually quite similar to the order that appears in your introduction. It's just reversed. So you may start with your opening hook, and then you end your paper by relating to the opening hook. You answer the so what, you create this bridge and context for your reader, and then you have this argumentative thesis statement. It may end your introduction, but it starts your conclusion. So you actually have created another set of bookends. So there's this bookend within bookends, and it again creates this sense of cohesion, and it really makes your strong paper. Your conclusion is what you are leaving your reader with, and you don't want to leave them with this petered out idea or just a summary of the paper, because it's boring. You want to leave them with something. You want to leave with this power, with this strength and this conviction. And a strong conclusion can do wonders to the effectiveness of an overall paper. Yes, it's not the easiest thing in the world. Yes, it's kind of confusing. It can be time consuming, but really when you nail the conclusion, oh my gosh, it's amazing. Your paper just sings and it's awesome. So if you follow this structure, follow these strategies, you can really transform your conclusions and ultimately make positive effects on your paper overall.